Welcome, everyone, once again to this week's episode. We're glad to have you with us here at 15 Minutes and a Big Idea. We're continuing through the book of Philippians, and we are into a powerful section. We're into a section where Paul is in prison, and he's telling us how do we handle that? How does he handle it, and how does Christ change that situation? You're going to hear more in the introduction, but this is a powerful section of verses. And the way that Paul approaches this, I think, has to be so formative for the way Christians think. And so I want to encourage you to share this with people. I want to encourage you that if you find this helpful, to pass it along to somebody, because I think this is where we grow in Christian maturity. Having the mind that Paul has here is having the mind of Christ towards suffering and difficulty and what's ultimately important and true value. And so I believe this is part of a fundamental building block of Christians growing to maturity. And so I want to encourage you, if you find this helpful, to share with other people so that we can get the mindset of Christ as we move forward. You can do that through our Facebook page, Instagram, lots of ways you can interact and share with that. So I want to encourage you in that. If you enjoy this, that's a great way to help us out. Facebook page, you follow us on YouTube at the Mended Collective, Instagram, or just text an episode to a friend. It's a great way to move this forward. We're going to begin in Philippians chapter 1, verses 18 through 20. We're going to start in the back half, the last little bit of Philippians chapter 1, verse number 18. There's a sentence break there, and so we're going to start there at the end of verse 18. It says, "But not only that, I also will rejoice, for I know that this will turn out for my deliverance through your prayers and the provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, according to my eager expectation and hope, that I will not be put to shame in anything, but that with all boldness Christ will even now as always be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death." As we mentioned, this is a continuation of Paul's joy and his rejoicing that we've talked about the last two episodes, and is going to really reach its fever pitch and its apex next week and continue on down through the resolution. There's an incredible statement of faith and trust in Christ that sort of becomes the model and mirror, as we mentioned, for how Christians should live with faith in Christ and care for their sisters and brothers, raising those goods, the glory of Christ and the good of Christians as the ultimate ends in our minds, and our own personal benefit falls below those. Regardless, to this point, we've seen Paul's choice to rejoice, even though he's in prison. It's a miserable place to be, but Paul is joyous because, in a surprising turn of events, though what seemed to be a hindrance to the gospel, him being in prison, has turned out to further the gospel. It's going forwards, not backwards. It means more people have a desire to declare the message of Jesus Christ, which is a testament to the gospel being bigger than any one person except for Christ himself. And Paul is not unaware that some people who are motivated to preach by his imprisonment are doing it out of bad motives. They're doing it for the wrong reasons. They're doing it to exalt themselves. Paul is not unaware of that, but he still moves forward and rejoices in what he can. That's not going to steal his joy that Christ is proclaimed. And he refused to give their teaching and complaints about it any airtime, and instead finds gladness and delight that Christ's name is being exalted. So today, we're going to continue this line of thought as Paul continues to find joy. And today's big idea is to rejoice in Christ's exaltation. All right? To understand what it means to rejoice in Christ's exaltation. Number one, Paul will be delivered. Number two, hope leads to boldness. And number three, life and death are irrelevant. Some incredible, groundbreaking ideas. Paul will be delivered. Hope leads to boldness. And life and death are irrelevant. So delivered, boldness, and irrelevant. Let's start with Paul's statement where he says, not only that. What does he mean by that? Not only what? Well, this goes back to the fact that he's going to rejoice that Christ is preached in pretense or in truth. Whatever the reason, Christ is preached, and he's going to rejoice in that as long as the truth of the message of the gospel is unadulterated. People can preach out of suspect motives, but Christ is preached. That's what matters. Not only that, he says, I will rejoice for this reason. The preaching of Christ is part of his reason for rejoicing, but also what he's going to say. Basically, it's Paul's way of saying, and another thing. Not only is Paul going to rejoice for what we saw last week, he's going to rejoice for the following reason that we read in verse number 19. And it's because he has confidence. His confidence, incredibly, is that this situation is going to turn out for his deliverance, his exodus from prison. One way or another, Paul's going to get out of prison. As we'll see in verse number 20, that exodus that we talked about, that deliverance from prison, may not be on the terms that one expects, but Paul still is sure of it. We'll save that for when we get there, though. Let's read carefully. What are the means and the agents that will bring about Paul's deliverance? What are the things that are going to combine to cause that to occur, that he has confidence in so that he knows he'll be delivered? He says, your prayers and the provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ. Just like Paul prayed for the good of the Philippians, Paul notes the Philippians are praying as well. This prayer that's going on between them and this solicitation and acknowledgement is a mutual thing. It's going on together, and Paul expects that to continue to occur. Paul welcomes this prayer as it's going to be part of what delivers him from this situation. He believes that the Philippians' prayers are going to enact an exact change in this situation, that if they pray, things will be different. But he doesn't just say that. He's confident because of the provision of the Spirit of Christ. He knows that that will turn out for his deliverance as well. Notice he doesn't say what that's going to look like, but he has confidence in Christ's Spirit that it's going to supply him or provide for him. And this is a pretty good posture to have as Christians. I think this is a posture we really need to have, because it's really easy to want to start to speculate about how things are going to go and to say the Spirit will do this or the Spirit will do that. We must trust the supply of the Spirit of God, and that means trusting the Spirit to come to its own terms for the manner in which it will supply. We don't get to determine how God is going to act, but we trust that he will. All right, because of this confidence, he has this confidence that he'll be delivered by the prayers of the saints and the provision of the Spirit. We come to this next idea. He says he has eager expectation and hope, which leads to boldness, as we'll talk about. He knows that he won't be put to shame, and so he is bold. That's that second idea. This confident expectation and fervent hope leads to boldness, to standing up, to being able to, we might say, stand up straighter and speak louder. Let's look at these words, expectation and hope. And if you dive into these, you'll find out they are almost complete synonyms. The list of words and their description, their definitions is almost just complete overlap. They are really, really similar in the way they function. In both cases, it refers to an anticipation, but it's not just a pipe dream or something that you dream up that you wish would occur. This is a desired future outcome that one views as highly probable, most likely, to the point of being essentially guaranteed. I'll say that again. It is an outcome that is desired in the future that one views as so highly probable and likely, it is essentially guaranteed. Just as your present moment, the moment, whatever you're doing right now, okay, maybe you're driving in your car, you know you're driving in your car, you're setting in your home, you know you're setting in your home. And that confidence about the fact that you exist and that you have a brain and that the material world around you is real in some sense. That confidence allows you to do things like if you're driving, you drive, you steer the wheel. That present awareness of what's going on dictates the future decisions you're about to make. And for Paul, it's going to be the same. He is so sure with this expectation of deliverance that he's planning around it as an eventuality. He takes it for granted that it will occur. Why does he take it for granted? Why does he take it for granted? How can he think that deliverance from prison is something is so sure he'll be delivered? He says because he knows God's not going to put him to shame. God's not going to do this. A person who makes incorrect predictions about the future or the future in general becomes an object of scorn. And Paul knows God's not going to allow that to happen to him, which may be thinking, this is starting to sound a little presumptuous, Paul. It sounds like you're making up the scenario here. What should we say about this? Well, Paul knows that God's not going to put him to shame. So this clarity gives him a resolve. It gives him a resolve. It gives him an awareness of what direction he should go because he knows how it's going to be. It means he's going to be bold. You know, there's times in life, like most of them, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what's going to happen. And so we need a plan B. We don't know how things are going to shift out, how things are going to break. So we make a plan B. We make a contingency plan. And that's good and that's a wise thing to do. Sometimes the need for a plan B means that plan A has to be different. We got to leave that backdoor option open. So plan A can't be full bore, totally, completely intense, only option. We got to leave a backdoor so we can have a plan B because we don't know. For Paul, he knows exactly what's going to happen. There's no need for a plan B here. He doesn't need plan B. It's all plan A. And with that being the case, he is full throttle at the task he's been assigned to. He doesn't fear, he doesn't waver in boldness because he knows what's going to happen. And so that comes to our final point, which we've sort of kicked around a little bit. So we might ask, how is it that Paul knows he's going to be delivered? Has Christ told him? Is he aware of the political machinations that seem to indicate he's going to be released? We might first notice that Paul does not use the word released. He does not use the word released, but the word delivered. That is, Christ is going to get him out of here. He says this as he has boldness What is that boldness? Why does he have boldness? Because Christ is going to be exalted in his body. Listen, by life or by death. And this is why Paul is not presumptuous, because he knows that he's either going to live or die. Those are the only two options. It's either A or not A, and that is it. He's either going to live or he's going to die. And this is where Paul's perspective changes from what is natural and understandable, even reasonable, to a mindset that is transformed by Christ and who he is. It's also with this that we get Paul's perspective on what he means by deliverance. For us, we might be delivered from prison as, well, they let me go. I get out of here. But for Paul, life or death will mean deliverance. One way or another, Christ is going to get him out of that cell. That difficulty he's in, he's not going to stay there forever. It might be in a box, but his stay in prison is temporary. He's going somewhere else. And more than that, more than the hope of the fact that he's getting out, he knows that he's going to get out and Christ is going to be glorified. Whether he lives or whether he dies, Christ is going to be made great. And so he's able to go with boldness, whatever it takes. With that in mind, he's able to rest easy. And this is where human systems of value break down. This is where human systems of value versus the value of Christians take a significant departure from one another. They split off because humans, after our own will, without Christ, we take the thing of, we got to preserve life. Preserving life is the most important thing. Death is the worst thing that could happen. Whereas with Christ, death is no longer the worst thing that could happen. For Paul, death is a completely acceptable option. And it's completely acceptable because Christ will be glorified either way. The only option that is not acceptable is that Christ is not glorified. And they say there's not a more dangerous thing than a person with nothing to lose. As Christians, we have Christ for us. And we know because of the resurrection of Jesus Christ that has transformed the way we view the world, that God has solved the problem of death in Christ Jesus. That in Christ we know that death is not the ultimate end, and that means we live differently. That Christ's resurrection is a prior taste of what will happen to all the saints. For Paul, the worst thing would not be death. A far worse fate than death would be that Christ is not glorified through his life. So as we close this up, I know we've gone a while here, but this is so foundational to a Christian mindset, to have the mind of Christ and the mind of God, as we see through his servant Paul. He's going to continue to unpack this, but this must radically reframe the way we think of suffering and trials and every moment that we live. Paul has allowed Christ to turn his perception inside out so that it is almost unrecognizable by human standards. Imagine that. Forget about Christianity for a moment. You meet someone in a hospital, and they just say, well, the best thing that could happen is I die. It doesn't matter if I live or die. That's not the way humans think. Rather, Christ has changed things. He has confidence in a good result, and that best result might include him dying. And this is a place where Christians need to get to. And part of the freedom that Christ gives us, Hebrews talks about how we as humans have all throughout our existence been slaves to death. That Satan has been able to wag his crooked finger over us and say, but you're going to die, and Christ changes that. When we have that sort of standard in our minds, a realization that death is not the worst enemy. The worst thing that could happen to us is Christ not being glorified by us. We become unstoppable. So how do you relate to death as we think about what this means? We ask some questions. Are you certain in the promises of God? Or do you waver? Do you have your heart set on the reward of Christ and knowing Christ? How does the fear of death, how does the fear of humans, not even human death, but the fear of the scorn of people inhibit your service to God? In what ways would a freedom from fear of death empower you to greater Christian service? Is the exaltation of Christ your ultimate goal? Ask yourself, what do you value more, and what do your actions say? Do you value your life or the glorification of Christ? Thank you so much for joining us today on 15 Minutes and a Big Idea. Today's big idea: rejoice in Christ's exaltation.